So hello and thanks for joining this webinar about ISMS scope. Okay, let's wait a minute for everyone to join. While we are waiting, where are you joining this webinar from? I'm calling in from Zagreb, Croatia, and how about you? So let me know where you are joining from just to see how far this webinar goes. And yeah, while we are waiting for your answers, just a couple of notes. So we are recording this webinar, so you'll be able to watch it from the same page actually where you registered for this webinar. And also you'll be able to download this presentation deck. So after the webinar, we'll publish the PDF presentation deck in the comment section, again in the same page where you actually watched this webinar. So this will be, let's say, 5 to 10 minutes after the webinar is completed. So you will see, simply go for the comment section and there you will see the link which will take you to which will enable you to download the presentation deck. Okay, so yeah, let me see. Okay, very well. So let me start with this. Let me officially start with the webinar. So yeah, welcome to this webinar, how to set the ISMS scope according to ISO 27001. My name is 𝗿𝗲𝗴𝗶𝘀𝗁 and I'm the main ISO 27001 NIS2 and 𝗂𝗲 expert at 𝗹𝗲𝗿𝗲, and 𝗹𝗲𝗿𝗲 is a company that makes compliance easy to understand and simple to use. And this webinar today is streamed through LinkedIn live events and also YouTube live, and it will last approximately 40 to 60 minutes, depending really on the number of your questions. And by the way, please do ask questions, as much as you want. I'll try to make this webinar as interactive as possible. So you can ask your question during the webinar and I'll try to answer it. If there is anything left unanswered, then I'll also cover this in a Q&A session. So please do cover ask your questions, and it will, it will be a more interesting webinar if you do ask questions. Okay, very well. Now let me move on to the next slide. Okay, so first of all, why is setting the scope important? It's important because actually it determines lots of things that will happen later on. And, to simplify the whole thing is that, if you go for a smaller scope, you will have, let's say, less things to implement, but you will have also potential problems with, let's say, other parts of your company which are included in the scope, which are not included in the scope. And those, as opposed to this, if you go for a larger scope, then you will have let's say, more things to implement, but less complications with these other parts of the company that actually you included then in the scope. So I'll explain these options during the webinar, but the point is that setting the scope actually happens at the very beginning of the project, and this has, I would say, lots of consequences later on. So this is something that you have to be careful about in the very beginning. So in the webinar today, I'll define how this setting the scope works, also what the certification auditor are looking for, what are the pitfalls that you have to avoid. And this webinar is intended for consultants, but also for implementers. So basically anyone who is really dealing with ISO 27001 implementation, compliance, these kind of things. Good. So one of the main points today is that when you actually define the scope, this means that you actually have to determine what you want to protect, or which kind of, let's say, data, which kind of information you want to focus on protecting. This is really setting the scope. So setting the scope is not really about just choosing which safeguards or which controls to use to protect this information. So no, this is actually happening later on in the project in 27001. This is when you actually define the statement of applicability. But when you define the scope, you're basically saying, okay, I want to focus on protecting data or information in this part of the company. And this is basically what the ISMS scope means. And it's I'm emphasizing this because very often people have a wrong idea of what the definition of the scope is. Okay, good. Now let me go through today's agenda, and by the way, let me know which through chat which of these topics you're interested in the most, and this will give me an idea on which topics I should focus on during the presentation. So let me know. Just send me a short message through chat if you are particularly interested in any of these topics. This will give me the feedback on where to spend most of the time today. Okay, so I'll take you through, explain you how you need to document the scope, which document to use. Actually, there are two documents where this is specified. Also, what needs to be included in these documents, these kind of things. Then I'll actually explain you what are these dependencies and interfaces, because I've noticed this is a pretty big unknown for most people. And also this process of defining the scope. Basically, you have to go through a couple of steps when you define the scope. Also, there is very often a question around, how do you define the scope if you have, if you're using cloud services, if you're having, let's say, scope, if you're having, if you use, I don't know, if your virtual servers are in the cloud. And also, I'll explain how you handle security with third parties, with your suppliers and so on. So how do you actually protect your information if this information is also processed outside of your scope? So I'll handle all of these things, and this is something that I'll go through today. At the end, we'll have this Q&A session. So if there are any questions that I did not answer during the webinar, then I'll answer at the end of the webinar. Okay, let me see if there are any suggestions here. So I see a suggestion from Daniel. Scope if servers are in the clouds, and also handling security within the scope of third parties. Okay, so I'll definitely cover these topics as well, and thank you for this input. Okay, great. Yeah, let me move on. Let me turn this off. Okay, very well. So where the first question is really where you have to define the scope, and actually the scope is defined in two separate documents. The first document where you have to define it is your own internal ISMS scope document, where you actually go into much more detailed description on what you have to protect. And I'll show you in a couple of slides. I'll also show you an example of how this could look like. And the second document where you actually define the scope is in ISO 27000 certificate. So if your company goes for the certification, then you also have to specify the scope in your certificate. Your certificate will say which scope is covered. Now the main difference is that this first one, ISMS scope document, is your internal document for your internal use, whereas the ISO 27000 certificate is a public document. It's for a public use. The first document is much more detailed. You actually go into, well, let's say 1 or 2 pages where you explain what are the elements of your scope. The second document, this certificate, is it has only one sentence, that describes your scope. So basically saying, okay, your scope is, I don't know, your IT services or your IT department, these kind of things. Okay, now, how should actually, what you need to include in this first document, this ISMS scope document, which is internal. So basically you define your scope in terms of processes, departments, and locations. Okay, so you could, for example, say, okay, you are, I don't know, pharmaceutical company, and since let's say for pharmaceutical companies, usually the most sensitive information is really in their R&D department, right? Then you say, okay, we want our pharmaceutical company to set the ISMS scope for R&D departments. And then within this R&D department, we have a couple of processes. I don't know, one process is for, I don't know, the development of new, medications. The other one is, I don't know, for testing, this kind of thing. So basically these processes are within the scope, within this R&D department. And then this department is physically located on this and this location. So this is, how you actually could specify, this is our, let's say, regular way to specify the scope. Also, what you normally would specify, what are the exclusions. So you could say, okay, we are using, I don't know, cloud services, and then we are including the data which we control in these clouds, but we are excluding physical servers which are handled by the cloud provider. I'll speak more about this a little bit later on when I explain this, how to handle from the scope perspective, how to handle these cloud services. You could also say that you're excluding, temporary workers, like, students or, or someone else who is not really so important for this R&D department. Now, what is usually what is not acceptable when it comes to definition of the scope, you cannot define the scope around the product. You cannot say that, your, for example, our company advisor has this product 𝗂𝗲𝗴𝗶𝘀𝗁. I'll actually show this also a little bit later on. And you cannot say that your scope of certification is a product like 𝗂𝗲𝗴𝗶𝘀𝗁. It doesn't work. What you could do to, work around it is that you define that within the scope are your departments which support this particular product. And then you could say, okay, you have, software development department, you have, operations department, you have, IT department, you have, customer support department that support this particular product. So this would be a way around to actually define which departments are the ones that are in charge of this product. You also cannot define the scope around technology. You cannot say that your scope is, a particular server. It's not going to be acceptable. And you also cannot, define in the scope what are the controls from NXA. Why? I'll actually show you this in the next slide, because you actually select the controls not when you define the scope, but later on once you complete your risk assessment. So this is why you cannot define the controls which are included in the scope document. Okay, let me see if any questions came in. Okay, Ali is asking if this will be recorded. So yes, the webinar is recorded, and you will be actually able to watch the recording of the webinar in the same page where you are actually watching this this webinar now. So the recording will appear in let's say 5 maybe 10 minutes after the webinar is over. So simply stay on the same page where you are watching this webinar now. Okay, very well. let me move on and define actually when at which point of time actually in your project is the scope defined. And basically first the step actually before defining a scope is the collecting the requirements of interested parties. And this is important because these interested parties might actually influence your scope. So in case of let's say this pharmaceutical company, there is usually a regulator, and this regulator might actually impose to which, let's say, part of the company this standard needs to be applied to. Okay, you could have, regulations like GDPR, which also influence to which parts of the company you focus on. You might have clients which specifically ask you to implement the standard for a particular area of your company. So first you have to collect all of these inputs and then actually define where to which parts of your company you want to define you want to implement the ISO 27001. Now after that comes the definition of the top level information security policy. After that you go actually through this risk assessment and treatment, and only after that you actually go for the statement of applicability, and in the statement of applicability you define which controls you're going to apply and which controls you're not going to apply. So I'm showing you this diagram just to show you why you can't really define the controls which will be used, the safeguards that will be used in the ISMS scope document, because it comes actually much earlier in the project, and in order to define which controls you need, first you actually have to go through this risk assessment and treatment, because most of the controls are actually selected because of risks. And this comes after you define the scope. Okay, let me see if there are any questions. Okay, Ruben, thanks. Thanks for watching the webinar. Okay, great. Now let me move on to the next slide, and this is really a couple of suggestions here on when you write this scope document. So what is usually not documented? Of course you can write these things, but they're not recommended. For example, you're usually not documenting the internal and external issues. So you could theoretically write them in your ISMS scope document, but this is not really required by the standard, and this will only take you some additional time. Second thing that is not required to write specifically in the scope document are dependencies and interfaces. Now, just to clarify, you must actually determine the dependencies and interfaces, but you do not need to document them. And why am I telling you this? Because I've seen some companies, especially smaller companies, spending weeks, even months, determining these dependencies and interfaces, rather than, finishing the whole project. Because if you're a company of, let's say, 10, maybe 20, 30 employees, you can, complete your whole ISO 27000 implementation in a matter of months. Now, these companies, spend months defining the scope. It doesn't make sense, okay? So trying to write down all of these dependencies and interfaces, this is not required. So, my recommendation is do not do it. I'll explain you what these are, but you do not have to write them down. Also, what you shouldn't typically write down are these list of assets. So it's not necessary that you write this in your scope document, because again, it will only slow you down, and you will list these assets later on, most probably during your risk assessment. So don't do it too early, because again, it only slows down your project. Right, now let me now explain the dependencies and interfaces. And actually I see a question now from Ruben. Is it possible to make the scope based on specific business process? So yes, as I mentioned a couple of slides earlier, so you can actually, you should define your scope in terms of departments, processes, and locations. So definitely processes are important, let's say one of the important ways to describe this whole thing. Actually, I forgot to tell you just when I describe this process here, there are actually some other articles on our website which explain these steps. So you can actually find more information about risk management, risk assessment and treatment in this article called the ISO 27000 Risk Management Complete Guide. And my colleague had sent you now this link through the chat window. You can actually see it in the chat. Now, if you joined through YouTube, you can click this link and open it without any issues. If you joined through LinkedIn, then you will see this URL, but you will not be able to click it because of the LinkedIn policies. So the workaround here is simply for you to copy and paste this, copy this URL and paste it into your browser, and you will be able to open this link. It will work this way. What we will also do is after the webinar is completed, we will again repost all of these links on the LinkedIn page, and then after the webinar they will actually become clickable. So again, because of this, let's say, issue with the LinkedIn webinar, I mean, for you that joined through LinkedIn, we will repost all of these links later on, and you will be able to click them without any problems after the webinar. Okay, so anyway, this is one article. The other article is about statement of applicability. If you want to learn more, here is the article called Statement of Applicability in ISO 27001, what it is and why does it matter. So again, it's something that gives you a more idea on how to handle statement of applicability. Okay, anyway, let me move on with the slide about dependencies and interfaces. So basically, what are these dependencies and interfaces? So first of all, when you analyze your company, you have to see, when considering the departments within the company, what are they dependent on? So in this case, you see a company A, it has, I don't know, 3 core processes, and it has 3 support processes. And basically you decided that all of these core processes and support processes are part of your ISMS scope, which is great. And then you have to actually see which processes or let's say services they are dependent on. Okay, and then you can say, okay, this ISMS scope is dependent on software development and maintenance. Okay, so you have, let's say, a third-party provider who is actually, software developer, and they are developing some kind of software and maintaining the software, so you're dependent on them. Okay, you also have a lawyer who is providing legal services. This is also you're dependent on. You're also dependent on cleaning services for your offices, and you're dependent on accounting services. So basically, these are dependencies, and simple as that. So you don't have to think too much about it. You simply see what do you depend on. Okay. Now, another thing are interfaces. And if these are third-party companies, if you have a separate company which develops software, then your interface with them is, let's say, email through which you communicate with them, or phone, or let's say any kind of access that they have some, or let's say a VPN connection or whatever they are, let's say, connected with you. So the interfaces are basically either let's say physical interfaces, like a door, and then a door actually separates physically you with some other third party, or some logical interfaces or technological interfaces that stand between you and this supplier. Legal services also. So the interface basically between you and them are, I don't know, email, telephone, these kind of things. Cleaning services, basically it's basically the interface between you and them is that they're simply an external provider, and accounting services very similar to legal services. So the point here being is that the interfaces depend on which kind of relationship you have with these third-party providers. Okay, so if you have any more questions around these interfaces and dependencies, let me know, and I can explain this even further. Now, there is also an article on our website. It's called How to Define the ISMS Scope, and you can also find some more information about scope and also about these dependencies and interfaces in this article. Okay. Good. Now let me move on to the next slide, and basically, it's about the process. So how do you actually define? What are the steps actually to define the ISMS scope? So first of all, you should start with your company size. And if your company is, let's say, less than 50 employees, so 50, less than 50 employees, it's typically easier actually to set the ISMS scope for your whole company. Now, why is this so? Because, if you're trying to, let's say that you have, I don't know, 45 employees, and that you want to define the scope for only 20 of those employees, and you want to keep 25 employees outside of the scope. You will actually have to think very hard, how to define these dependencies and especially interfaces in such a small company. Because, for example, let's say that you have two departments in a small company, but they're sitting in the same room. Okay, the people from the two departments are sitting in the same room. They're working on the same local network. They're using the same software. I mean, some kind of a software which you shared within the company. It will be very hard actually to separate them. In other words, there are no interfaces between them, right? So this is why it's recommendable for smaller companies to go for the whole company, because it's you don't have to artificially separate, let's say, these people that work together. Now, if you are larger than 50 employees, then these companies that are larger typically have a clear organizational structure. They have separate departments, separate offices, and so on, and then it's easier actually to exclude some of the departments from the scope. So you should start with the company size to determine whether you actually go for a whole company or only a part of it. Now, if you're a larger company than 50 employees, then you actually go through these other steps. And then you have to actually analyze where in the company you have the most sensitive information. So again, you have an example of pharmaceutical company. This could be an R&D department. In cloud service, a cloud provider, you know, this will be probably an IT department, customer service department, IT production department, this kind of thing. So it's you actually have to consider, you know, where is the most definitely the most sensitive information, where it is located. I see a question from Jack. Can HR department be excluded? Yes. So again, if you're a company larger than 50 employees, you can actually exclude your human resources department. If you don't see this something as the most crucial, as something that doesn't handle the most sensitive information, then yes, you can exclude it, the HR department. So anyway, second step is really to focus where the most sensitive information is, and then the third step is to see what are the requirements of interested parties. As I already explained, you simply go with and analyze what your interested parties are requiring. So for example, let's say that, I don't know, you have a client who specifically wants your software development department to be certified. Well, then you will have to include at least software development department and potentially something else as well. And then find out what are these dependencies. If you remember the diagram from my previous slides, you have to see what these departments within the scope depend on. And then after that, you see if you have to analyze if these interfaces are clear enough. If these interfaces are clear enough, then you can actually exclude these other parts of the company. If these interfaces are not clear enough, in other words, if there is no clear line between what would be in the scope and outside of the scope, then you'll probably have to change what you want to be included in the scope. Good. Now, I'll actually show you now how you can actually document this ISO 27001 scope using Conformio software. So let me switch the screen. Just give me a second. Okay, for those of you who are already using Conformio, this is ISO 27000 software, which actually helps you implement the whole standard. It provides you with a list of steps, you know, that you have to go through to complete your implementation. And of course, one of these steps is to define the ISMS scope. And when you click it, you will actually see that this is actually a wizard which takes you through filling out of this document. So when you scroll down, you can see that you know, it has all these placeholders where you have to fill something out. And you know, when you basically click next, you know, it gives you actually the suggestions on what you have to fill out. And then, for example, names of the services and business processes that are included in the ISMS scope. And then you simply specify whatever you want. So let's say I don't know, you want customer support service to be included, and then you move on to the next. Then you have the IT department, let's say the customer department, and then move on next. You fill out the locations and so on. So basically, it's as simple as that. This kind of a software really, you know, speeds up the writing of not only the scope document but all the other documents as well. What is also good about this software is it actually also shows you then later on which documents you completed and how close you are actually to being fully compliant, and that you go for the certification. So you have these status of the documents, but also for each clause of the standard you can actually see if you are ready for the audit. So this is what helps you a lot in your implementation. Okay, now let me go back to my presentation. Yeah, I'll ask you now I will also send you now the link to this Conformio page where you can actually sign up for a free trial, and you can of course test this out. You can test this scope document out, but you can also go through any other document, including, I don't know, risk register and all the other things. Okay, very well. Now let me move on to the question of what if you're using cloud services, or in particular if you're using cloud servers, right? If you're, I don't know, using you're using YouTube or LinkedIn, this is also a cloud service, right? So how do you handle these things? but also how do you handle, I don't know, AWS or Microsoft Azure or any of these cloud services from the perspective of the scope. So basically the main idea here is that you can include in the scope only the things that you actually directly control, right? So basically, for example, if you have your own servers, this is the first row in this table. If you have your own physical servers on a third-party infrastructure, so you're basically having your own physical servers that are placed in a rack in a third-party data center, right? In this case, you can actually include in the scope hardware, meaning your servers, the software that is running on them, and also the data that is processed on these servers. Why? Because you're controlling hardware, software, and data. What you are not controlling is the physical building, is the air conditioning, are the telecom links. These things have to be excluded from the scope because you're not controlling them, right? If you have virtual server in a third-party computing infrastructure, okay, then you control only the software and data, but you are not controlling the hardware, right? The hardware in this case is controlled by the this cloud company. So in this case, you include in the scope only software and data, right? And then simply to skip to the last one. So if you're using simply a software as a service like you know, Gmail, for example, or I don't know, Office 365. In this case, you're not controlling the servers. You're not controlling the you know, you're not controlling the physical servers or the virtual servers. You're not controlling the software because this is all controlled by, let's say, Microsoft. The only thing that you control is the data. And in this case, for a software as a service, you're including only the data because this is the only thing that you can actually control. So depending on what kind of cloud service you're using, this will also determine what you can and what you cannot include in the scope. Right, now let me move on to the next slide, and this is how you actually handle security within the scope and how you handle the security outside of the scope if you're using some third parties to process your data. So for example, let's say that okay, you have several departments within your scope, but you're using a third-party accounting services, right? So, and of course, obviously, you will transfer some of your sensitive data outside of your scope towards this accounting service. So how do you actually manage the security in this case? And basically it's done this way. So within the scope, you are applying certain controls like, you know, here on the screen you have these A5 organizational controls, A6 people controls, physical controls, technological controls. So there are, as you probably know, 93 potential controls that you can actually apply within your scope to protect the data. Okay, this part is pretty clear. Now, when it comes to outside users, outside services that are outside of the scope, in this case, you actually have to regulate your relationship with them in a way that, for example, if you have this supplier, the accounting service, this is on the right-hand side in this diagram. In this case, you actually have to specify security clauses in the agreement with this accounting service, which you want this service provider to actually comply with. So you want a certain level of encryption that to be used. You want only certain employees of this service, accounting service, actually that to access your data, and so on and so forth. So you simply go for let's say several types of clauses, security clauses that actually guarantee or that increase the security of your data. Okay. Now, on the other hand, if you have some departments, this is on the left-hand side of this diagram, if you have some departments which are within your company but are outside of your scope, which again, it's very often the case for companies larger than 50 employees. In this case, you also have to treat these departments as external, let's say, services. So let's say that you determine that you want to include only your, let's say, IT department and I don't know, R&D department within the scope, but you said that, for example, your HR department is outside of the scope. Okay, so how do you then define let's say, and by the way, this HR department is of course processing some sensitive data from within your scope. For example, of let's say the employees, personal data of the employees which work within the scope. In this case, you actually have to regulate this relationship between the IT department and R&D department, which are within the scope, through, let's say, company-wide policies and procedures or some protocols. And this is how you impose on these other departments outside of the scope the security rules they have to follow. So in this case, you can define some security policies for HR department as well, even though they're outside of the ISMS scope. So this is the way to do it in, let's say, departments which are not part of the scope. Okay, we'll send you now also the link to this article. It's called 6-Step Process for Handling Supplier Security According to ISO 27001. So basically this article goes in more detail on what you actually have to do to make sure that that you actually handle this supply chain risk. Okay, very well. Now let me move on. Okay, let me see if there are any questions. If not, then I can move on. Yeah, so let me see some. Let me present you a couple of biggest challenges that I usually find people asking, how to resolve them, and then I'll move on to the conclusion and Q&A. So one of the big challenges is really definition of scope for SaaS solutions, and I've explained this in a slide before. So you have to define what you can control, and then you have to include in the scope the assets that you can control. Another challenge is agreeing within the company what are the most critical parts to be included in the scope. Okay, there is also this slide with the process that defines the process. So first start with the collecting the requirements of interested parties, and then once you actually collect them, then you will have a much clearer picture of what should be included. And then of course you have to discuss with the top management, because the larger the scope, the more expensive this implementation will be. So this is also something that needs to be taken into account, this let's say business aspect of security. Also a challenge is the approach, if you should define it by departments or by assets or by services. So again, the suggestion is that you actually define the scope in terms of departments and services and locations, because this is the best way really to, and this is something that the certification auditors prefer the most. Yeah, and also a challenge if the whole organization should be in a scope or only some entities or departments. Again, for me, this is primarily the question of the size. The smaller the company, the more likely you will actually go for the whole company. Okay, very well. Now let's move on to the short conclusion, and then I'll move on to the Q&A. So as you can see, if you define the scope correctly at the very beginning of your project, you will not actually go too wide or too narrow with your ISO 27001 implementation, and that will actually save you quite a lot of time later on. Because again, if you, let's say, go set this initial scope wrongly, then you will have actually quite a lot of problem later on. So it's really important that you set this correctly from the very beginning. And of course, for that purpose, you can use Advisor as 𝗂𝗲𝗏𝗏 software, and we've already shared the link with you to access this free trial. And we'll also send you now the meeting link to schedule a call with our 𝗂𝗲𝗏𝗏 expert, and he'll show you in more detail how the software works. Okay, good. Yeah, let me now move on to the Q&A session. Yeah, so okay, I'll start answering the questions if there are any now. So feel free to ask any questions through chat, and I'll be glad to answer them. And before I start answering these questions, just a couple of notes. Feel free to reach out to me directly to ask any question. And here is actually my email, and you can use this email to send me any questions that you want. Also, you can actually follow me on LinkedIn and on YouTube. On LinkedIn, I regularly post, let's say, the best articles on cybersecurity I find on the internet. So I post, let's say, 1 or 2 articles per day, and you can actually follow me on LinkedIn, on my profile on LinkedIn, to see these I would say most useful articles from all over the internet. And on YouTube, I publish lots of videos on YouTube. So if you want to learn more about how to handle ISO 27001, take a look at my YouTube profile. So we'll send you now also the links to both of these profiles. And the next, okay, here you go. Here's the here are the links. Good. And my next webinar will be on next Wednesday about ISO 27001 certification process. So I'll explain, what are the stages in the certification. I'll also explain how to what the auditor will be looking for, what kind of evidence they will be looking for, how to handle non-conformities, how to prepare for the certification. So I'll explain all of these things next Wednesday in the webinar, and we'll send you now the links to where you can actually sign up for these for this next webinar. So you'll see the links now in the chat window. Okay, very well. So let me see if any questions came in the meantime. So I actually don't see any questions, so I hope that it seems that I hope that I explained everything properly, so that everything was quite understandable. But in any case, you can always ask questions through email. So you have my email address now, and let me know if you want to ask anything else. So good. If there are no other questions, then let me just wrap up the webinar. So I mentioned this webinar today was intended to give you an overview of most important issues related to ISMS scope. It wasn't really intended to go into details of, risk assessment or implementing the controls. But again, if you want to learn more about ISMS implementation, documentation, risk management, risk register, then you can sign up for a free trial for 𝗂𝗶𝗀𝗏 and test all of these things out. We'll publish the PDF presentation deck together with all the links from today's webinar in the same page where you're watching the webinar now. And this is in the comments section. So if you're watching this on YouTube or on LinkedIn, come back in, leave this page open and come back in, let's say, 5 to 10 minutes. And then you'll see these links to download the presentation deck and also all the other links that were used during this webinar today. And again, for LinkedIn, if you join LinkedIn, these links will be clickable, so it will be easier for you to open them. And finally, we'll also send you a link to a short survey. It's really short, only 3 questions. So if you have time, I would be very grateful if you can fill this out just to get some feedback on how we are doing with these webinars. And this would be all. Thank you very much for your participation, and I hope you have enjoyed this webinar. Have a nice day.